Welcome everybody back to Veil of Sound. Now it's January 1st, 2024. When you clicked on this link, you have already seen that we want to start the year with a bang. And I'm very, very, very happy to have one of those persons that everybody here at Veil of Sound can agree on. That I'm very happy to have Aaron Turner here. Aaron, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's our high pleasure. Aaron, I've said that already to you when we spoke a little bit before. I want to have a look and I want to have a chat about you, not primarily as the musician, but as the visual artist, because I think that there is something that a lot of people forget when they talk about you, and also when they talk about HydraHead. A lot of people forget that what many of us saw but didn't recognize is that you were not only, how should I say, responsible for the roster building, but you were also responsible for, I think, not every artwork, but loads of artwork for HydraHead.
Yep, that's true. Quite a lot of it.
Sometimes under your own name, sometimes just under the name of Aaron, you know, various ciphers for that, but you've did most of them. And was that also something that you were interested in right from the start of the label, or did it just happen like that?
No, it was very intentional. One of the things that I appreciated as a music listener, and especially once I started getting into underground music, was how a lot of labels were sort of curating the visual aspect of their presentation. And that was what I had hoped to do with HydraHead, was kind of an overall curation of the music as well as the visuals. And for me, going back to early childhood, music and art were often tied together, sometimes in a peripheral way, sometimes very explicitly. So when it came to doing the label, as often as was possible, I tried to do the sleeves. I never enforced this as a policy with artists. If there were certain bands that wanted to do their own artwork, that was, of course, fine. However, I did always make it an option available to people. And I think it was something that eventually started to become part of the appeal of the label. We had this clear visual identity, and I was able to help match my aesthetic to whatever music was at hand, and the vision of the people involved.
It's really interesting that you say that there is, like, I don't want to say a corporate identity, because that's not it, but I think that you are totally right when you say that HydraHead Records were recognizable from something, and I cannot even pinpoint it. It probably is your style. But it's also interesting to see the change when we look at how that developed. When I think of the first few EPs, the Corin EP, the Vent EP, Milltown, Piebald, all of those were very different from each other. But correct me if I'm wrong. I think that corporate identity and that recognizability, that really took a huge leap when you did the cover series for the Black Sabbath tributes.
Well, the first handful of 7 inches that you mentioned definitely is kind of scattered in the visual presentation, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that I was either trying to figure out how to create a cohesive visual aesthetic, or it was just simply that I had nothing to do with the artwork, or the bands had a cover image and I sort of just put the pieces together. Yes, when it came to doing the series of Black Sabbath tribute 7 inches, I mean, one of the ideas was to have a visual through line connecting all of the releases. So cohesiveness with the graphic aspect of those was certainly the goal. And then I think also in tandem with that, I was starting to figure out a way to have just an overall cohesive visual presentation for the label, which did have something to do with my own style and also just with how I wanted the label to appear to people who were encountering our releases.
You've spoken about labels that you, when you grew up, that you saw and that you admired for their cohesive outward appearance. Can you pinpoint one or two of those? I have one or two in mind, but I would definitely say, but I'm not sure if we have the same ones.
Um, one that stuck out to me early on was Gravity Records, who are based in San Diego, and one of the things I liked about them is they had um, they had a handmade approach to a lot of their packaging, where they were either doing some kind of printing themselves on for all of the artwork, or in some cases it was simple as they had like a, you know, like an offset printed sleeve, but then they would hand write on each one. And they were using at times sort of semi unorthodox materials. Um, and that was really interesting to me, this combination of kind of mass production mixed with like a DIY, almost sort of arts and crafts approach to making things. But again, that the visual personality of the label was evident in not every release, but just sort of the catalog as a whole. And I later came to realize that one of the, you know, the main person behind the label was responsible for a lot of the graphics. So that was definitely one that that I became aware of as soon as I, like I said earlier, started getting into more underground music, punk and hardcore specifically. And then there were quite a few over the years that sort of reinforced that, um, just the premise that having a visual identity was maybe not quite as important as the musical identity, but certainly next in line. And on another end of the spectrum, but perhaps equally influential for me, was when I discovered Touch Records, who are based in the UK. And John Wozencroft, one of the co-owners of the label, also a very prolific designer, had a hand in, I think, just about every sleeve they ever did. And there was this very careful curation of the music as well as the sleeves. And it was interesting to me that, you know, especially at the time when I was buying a lot of records in stores, I could go into a shop and immediately identify a Touch sleeve. And for me, you could correlate this with the idea of corporate identity, but I never registered it on that level. It was more of an artistic identity, which um, you know, as I said before, kind of covered the music itself as well as the visuals, and that direct correlation, this overall concept of presentation, was really intriguing to me. And it wasn't just labels either; it was also individual artists. Um, and a few that come to mind were musically influential as well as visually influential for me. Godflesh, Swans, Neurosis, these bands that, you know, had a very clear visual identity, and there was a continuity from, you know, early releases all the way up through, you know, later ones, spanning decades. And that kind of focused approach to to their work was very very intriguing to me and part of the allure. It was clear to me that this was a total vision, and that was what I always strove for in my work, both with the label as well as the bands I was and am a part of.
You and I both grew up in the 80s, and I'm very sure we also know a lot of the same records. And I'm very sure you also know a lot of the New York hardcore scene records from back in the day, or generally those East Coast hardcore bands, which also had a very, very, I don't want to say clear and common aesthetic, but I think there was something like that. These live pictures on the back side of a t-shirt, for example, and a very, very similar kind of typo. Did that clear and sometimes even sterile kind of vision also appeal to you, or was that something where you say, no, that's too clean?
I mean, I was aware of it for sure, but that aesthetic was not influential for me. I mean, maybe the photography aspect of it, I did always enjoy seeing live pictures in the context of album layouts. And that was part of the allure for me, for sure, when I ended up moving to the East Coast myself. Just the idea of being able to see shows regularly and be a participant on that level. Where I grew up, we had shows for sure, but it was very small, and the shows were often few and far between. So this idea of these more massive gatherings definitely was compelling to me, and I like the you know, the idea of this moment in time captured and presented in a sleeve. But again, that wasn't a primary influence for me. I in fact, I preferred the things like I mentioned, Swans and Godflesh and Neurosis earlier. They were much more mysterious because the people involved were nowhere evident in the graphic presentation. So it kind of helped preserve the not the anonymity, but just kind of the magical secrecy around the creators. It was much more about centering the art and the music rather than the people behind it.
Yeah.
And for me, that made it more potent. And also, I mean, as far as like the East Coast hardcore thing is concerned, you know, there was kind of like this like macho sort of jock element to
tough
that
guy image,
stuff,
right?
which never really was appealing to me. I was not a tough guy. I was like a nerdy, you know, a nerdy hardcore kid who felt very much apart from that world of like macho male flexing. So that part of it was probably more intimidating or off-putting to me than alluring.
When we think about it that way, you've already said, you know, like very often you like to not be obviously part of the creation of an artwork. And does that also, and you also mentioned that, you know, the appeal of like live photography is something that struck you, but not something that you incorporated into your work. When we look at a lot of Aaron Turner artworks, visuals, posters, I very often have a feeling as if they are less focused on people. Very often they're abstracts. Is that also part of that whole thinking, that the music can speak on its own and the artwork is a part of it, but it's never too personalized?
Well, I think it's personalized in a way, to me, that's actually more effective, because it has more to do with kind of the hidden aspects of who we are, like presenting artwork that, or music that in some way is abstract or abstracted in some way or another, can say something about who the creator is in a way that a visual image of that person can't. So to me, it's more about like a presentation of the sides of us that are hidden or less available. And also, I think, again, just talking about like corporate presentation versus like a more artistic approach to being in a band or running a record label. The idea of musician as saleable persona is more of a corporate idea. It's the idea behind creating pop icons, whereas bands and labels and musicians who are more focused on creating sort of an artistic narrative around what they were doing, for me, made it more compelling because it wasn't the idea of trying to sell this person. It was an idea of this person's ideas centered as the focal point for what they were doing. And for me, there was definitely like not like an anti-social aspect to being involved in underground music, because part of it was very much about trying to find community, but I guess it was sort of this countercultural idea of purposely seeking out and advocating a different mindset where you're trying to say something that goes beyond you're trying to create something and be a part of something that has more to do with fulfilling people's souls than it has to do with entertaining people. And certainly entertainment is and was a factor. And I also think there's something about a lot of the music I've been lucky to be a participant in that it is about something more than merely just being entertained for a moment.
Yeah. Would you agree that a lot of the stuff that you have done is more about the thing behind the face than the face itself, the person behind the face?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of the things that a lot of the ways in which we are identified culturally speaking have more to do with our appearance outwardly than who we actually are. And for me, there's also something about trying to find sort of the universal aspects of who we are and who I am as a connective force through the work that I'm making or the work that I'm involved with facilitating. So for me, there can be an aspect of, say, a visual piece of abstract art that is more universal in its feeling than something that's more representative of and certainly than like for instance a photo of the artist. The photo of the artist is this very specific thing. You draw some very clear conclusions about who that person is based upon seeing them, whereas if you're engaging with a piece of abstract art, you might be able to become more connected to that because of what it stirs up in you. It's not about perceiving the other person and thinking about them. It's about engaging with something that helps you reflect inward.
Which helps you see a part of yourself then. So it's the interdependence of artist, art, and audience.
Yeah, and yes, it helps you see something of yourself, but it also is a connective thing where if you're able to connect with something that someone else has made on a purely almost intuitive level, then that barrier between yourself and the other person or other people is more permeable.
You've just mentioned intuitive. Is then part of the artwork that you do nowadays? Is it more intuition than plan?
I'd say it's a combo of both. I mean, I'm working on developing the continual development of my own individual voice, and I'm also trying to think less about what I'm making and feel more of
Mhm.
what's happening in the moment that it's being created. And that's another reason why improvised music has become more prevalent in what I am pursuing.
Mhm.
Because it's less about forethought and it's less about um, uh, perceiving an end result than it is about just inhabiting the moment at which something is
Mhm.
unfolding.
When I take this up for a moment and speak about music for a second, is then maybe a series of live recordings of your music a bit more appealing nowadays than a, let's say, double album with a whole concept behind it?
Not necessarily. It really depends on what it is.
Mhm.
I think I think just in terms of fidelity, still what is possible in a studio setting versus what's possible in a live recording
Mhm.
um, is important to me. Like just thinking about what we do with Sumac, for instance. Um, I think there's been some live recordings that we've done, the quality of which is pretty decent, but which still isn't quite up to the level of what we're able to get by being in a
Mhm.
studio for a few days and really
Mhm.
working on mic placements and working with an engineer who has a specific idea about how to achieve the sound they have and the sound we want, versus a live recording where a lot of times it's just whatever can be thrown together in a short amount of time. Um, that said, there is never a way in the studio, or I shouldn't say never, in my
Hardly.
experience. And in my experience, it is rare to be able to capture the same kind of energy in a studio recording as what is transmissible in the live setting. A part of that has to do with the fact that in the live setting, um, just the physical proximity of the performers to one another, and also the energetic exchange between performer and audience is there. Um, so I don't know. I mean, both scenarios have their appeal,
Mhm.
and there are things about each that are more potent or more appealing than the other.
Mhm.
And I don't necessarily see one as really being better than the other. They're just different, and it really depends on what we're trying to get out of it.
Mhm. Yeah, I was just thinking about what you've just mentioned, the connectivity and the feedback and the reversal of influence on sound between an artist on stage and his or her audience. Yeah, I can see what I totally get what you mean, that both have its pros and cons, of course. Um, when we look at artists like yourself, and you've already hinted at it, um, very often we talk about periods. Could you identify periods in your work where you say like, oh, for example, the first 10, 15, 7 inches that we did for HydraHead were, as you said, a little different. There were a little bit more over the place. Or, there I found a certain style that I liked to do, and now it's maybe something totally different. Do you see periods in your work?
Um, I could probably break it down into periods to some extent.
Mhm.
There are things which are continuous from the time I started drawing as a child up to the present day. And then there are moments in which my focus perceptibly shifted from one method of working to another. Um, it would be hard for me without kind of sitting and considering and
Mhm.
maybe even taking notes and looking back at the, the archive of my work to clearly define what the periods are. Um, I would say one of the most major shifts for me, though, was in the early days of HydraHead. I was not very adept at using a computer, so I was still doing quite a few things by hand. And then uh, as the years went on and I learned
Yeah.
more about how to use the computer as a design tool, I became more interested in using it that way, and making sleeves that were, very evidently designed versus having been painted or drawn or collaged.
Hmm.
And that way of designing was very appealing to me for quite some time, and I think also had a lot to do with the way that, the sleeves ended up looking. There was a lot that I did that could not have been done without the use of a computer. um so I guess it's, you could roughly say digital versus analog.
Hmm.
And then after a period of years of, really heavy reliance upon the computer as my visual tool, I again started to shift back towards analog production, to the extent that now I try to do as little as possible with the computer, and do as much of any given project by hand as I can. Um,
Hmm.
and I think there was always something I tried to do in a lot of my design work, balancing, the evidence of the human touch with the work of a machine. And there were times certainly too where I wanted something to look almost absent of human touch, but largely I've always tried to find a balance between the two. Um, and now it's just swung more and more back towards the human hand as the main conduit for transmitting visual ideas.
Very interesting. I would not have guessed that you could do that so quickly. That's amazing. Um, you've hinted at, drawing as a child, and, like basically just simply probably liking art, right? Just like my little daughter does. But however, when did you notice? When was the point where Aaron noticed, okay, this is a little more than just I like to draw, or I like art in a way? When did you notice, oh, I'm really good at this?
Um,
Apart
I
from the
don't know
fact that
that
you
there.
probably say you won't, I know you're too humble to admit that you are really good. But when did you
Uh,
notice?
yeah, I don't know that there was a time where as a younger person, I had this recognition like, oh, I'm really good at art. However, there was at a certain point, probably in my early teenage years, where I realized I could do things that a lot of my peers couldn't or chose not to do.
Mhm.
I remember in junior high school, which would have been age 12 or 13, I had drawn the Slayer pentagram logo on the back of one of my school notebooks. And, it has some kind of, uh, um, it has a little bit of shading and perspective in the drawing. And I
Mhm.
remember this girl in my class was saying something like, "You didn't draw that." And I redrew it again to prove that I could do it. And I think that was a moment of realization where I was like, "Oh, I have this ability
Mhm.
to see something and copy it, and also this ability to conjure things on my own that some other people don't have." So there were times where it was clear to me that this was ability I had versus abilities that my peers had, like being really good at sports, for instance. Um, and As far as the other component of that is like, just being like, oh, I'm a kid who draws just like every kid draws, was just the fact that I kept doing it. And I realized that, when I was young, most kids drew. And then as I got older, that habit of drawing never stopped. It just was a
Mhm.
continuous part of my life. And there was never at least at that stage, a conscious recognition, like, oh, I'm still doing this. What does this mean? It was more just like, I enjoy this. I get something out of it, and I'm going to keep doing it.
Is there nowadays like a time, or are there moments or weeks, better, let's put it in a bigger perspective, weeks or months when you do not draw, paint, design anything? Or is this still to this day a daily, bi-daily, you know, a regular habit?
I would say that it's regular in that there's never been a point during my life where I stopped for any considerable period of time. However, just because of the flow of life and the number of things in which I'm involved, both within my personal life as, you know, a partner and a parent, but also just in terms of workflow with a project. Sometimes I'm focused entirely on working on a piece of music, and other times I'm focused entirely on making visual art. And part of that is just out of necessity. Like, you know, again, to talk about what happens during an album cycle, writing the music obviously takes time, as does rehearsing and recording it. And during that time, I definitely spend a lot less time drawing and painting. Um, and then, you know, after a record is finished, I start thinking about the visual presentation for it. And so I'll spend a lot more time doing that and a lot less time making music. So that's the practical aspect of it. The In terms of creative flow, I also think it's beneficial for me to take breaks from both practices. If I step away from music or if I step away from drawing for a while, often when I come back to it again, there's kind of a renewed sense of purpose, and maybe even a different perspective on how to approach it. I think breaks offer they offer a moment for reflection and also a moment for incubation, where I don't have to actively process my ideas, but they're happening somewhere in the background. And then when I return to the paper or I return to my instrument, then those ideas that have been sort of simmering in the background can emerge in a different way.
When you do the artwork for your projects or other visual stuff, are you nowadays surer and more conscious of, okay, now it's finished, than before? That experience shows you, okay, that's a moment?
No. I think if anything, it's gotten harder as I've gotten older.
Okay.
And I think now a lot of times I just have to have a deadline that creates an end point for me. Because anything can just go on and on in terms of working on it. And at this point, for me, for instance, if we're talking about writing a song, it's not that I would rework the same part over and over. It's more that if I'm sitting with the composition, eventually I'll find a piece of the song that's not working the way I want it to and throw it out and and insert something else, or in some cases just abandon an entire composition. And similarly with a painting, for instance, I could look at it for a while, um, and maybe rework certain parts of it until I'm just at a point where either I'm sick of it or I have to turn it into something for a sleeve. and it is a source of it's I wouldn't say it's a source of stress necessarily, but it's something that I have to keep an eye on because no piece of music, no piece of art will ever be finished or developed to my complete satisfaction. And I think that's ultimately a good thing because it helps stave off complacency with my work. Um, uh, but yeah, like I said, it's just something to keep an eye on because if I don't have adequate time to work on something and develop it, then I'll end up with something um, that feels disappointing to me because I see the lack of development or I see the potential it could have reached that I didn't allow myself to reach. But then there's also the flip side of that, which is if I let something sit for too long, I'm going to be dissatisfied with it because the point at which the piece was generated was about the specific time and place in which it happened. And I've since moved on and therefore can no longer relate to that piece as I once did. So there's got to be a balance between having enough time to honor the genesis of something and develop it enough to a point of relative satisfaction versus getting so far away from the point that something began that it's no longer valid for me by the time I finish it.
The next question then is with a pinch of humor. I mean, like, how does the record label owner Turner then give the artist Turner a deadline? Or is that then the manufacturer of a sleeve who gives you the deadline?
I mean, I just know that a record's got to come out within a reasonable amount of time, and and I don't run a record label. I don't run HydraHead anymore. And even with Siege, we're tapering down quite a bit simply because those practical aspects of record production are less gratifying for me than they once were. However, my work is still obviously being produced by other record labels, and I'm not gonna make somebody wait around forever to get pieces from me because I know what that means for production. It's just it makes it very hard from a record label point of view to just be waiting and waiting and waiting on something, especially if you've already invested money in the project. Then it's just like something you're sitting on that ends up being dead weight. So like I said, having those practical boundaries around what I'm doing is helpful because I can just say, well, this has to be done by this period of time. That means I need to allocate a certain amount of hours every day up until, deadline in order to hopefully get something realized to the point of it being good enough. And I say that truthfully. Like like I said, I don't think there's ever going to be something that feels perfect to me, and I'm glad for that. I just have to get it to the point where I feel like I've done the best I could at that particular moment in time.
I mean, like you've said that you are never 100% content with your work as a musician or as a visual artist. But how does it then feel when you see that your own artwork is now already been adapted and is already being in a second generation and source of influence on other people? I'll give you an example. Good friends of mine from around here, from Würzburg, Cranial, they have a record which very much looks like Terraformer by Knut. Knut's record, on the other hand, looks very much or not very much, but closely related to Signal 5 by ISIS that you, if I remember correctly, also designed. Do you then recognize something like that where you are being influenced?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've definitely seen sleeves from other bands and other artists where I can see some element of what I have done having trickled out into somebody else's work. And I think it's a totally natural and normal thing that happens. It's a necessary part of being an artist. Nothing is created in a void. Nobody develops a context that is 100% their own. I do think that there are certainly artists who are visionary and come up with things that are highly unique to them. And even those artists almost always have some identifiable DNA within their structures. So I'm glad to have provided inspiration for other artists in the same way that I'm grateful to have received inspiration from so many artists and musicians throughout my life. And I think for me, it has been a source of not of satisfaction necessarily, but kind of an indicator that I've done something that has been it's been potent enough to have impacted other people. And I think, yeah, ultimately that's been a good indicator that I've done something worthwhile.
Let me once again assure you, you have. Something that, of course, I have to ask, for you as a visual artist, not only in the sense of giving your own label some kind of cohesive visual appearance, but which artists in general had an influence on you developing your style?
I mean, it's a whole, at this point, it would be hard to narrow it down. And again, there's periods too. The periods early that I can identify early on would be, discovery of comic book and fantasy artwork. There was a whole series of books I read when I was a kid that were about, knights and witches and wizards and all of those sort of fantastical things. And the illustrations in those definitely imprinted themselves on me. And same with comic books. I read comics from a pretty early age, both the mainstream type things as well as more underground stuff. And that had a lot to do with how I started developing as an artist, was just looking at that stuff and either copying it directly or emulating it. And then later, in my teenage years, I was exposed to fine art, both historical and current. And I went to university for fine art essentially, and was exposed to more there. And I think that sort of dual exposure and interest has been a constant for me up to the present day, where there's stuff that's pop art or supposedly lowbrow art, commercial art, that's had a lot to do with what I have chosen to do and what's interested me, and also fine art, which has had another different and equally important impact on what I do.
I mean, I know that you nowadays live a little bit outside of the beaten paths on an island in, if I remember correctly, Vancouver Sound. How often do you have a chance?
Puget Sound,
Puget Sound, sorry.
which, yeah, no, it's fine.
That is the sound offside of Seattle, right? Puget Sound?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. How often do you have a chance, or how often do you in general go to art shows nowadays?
Almost never. Um, a lot of what I encounter is just looking at books and looking at the internet. When I have the opportunity, it's nice to be able to see it in person. But most of the artwork that I'm seeing in person in my life these days is done by people I know. So that's my encounter with artwork in real life, as it were. Um, Living where I live, there's just, I mean, I could get to the Seattle art museums relatively easily, but I don't have a lot of leisure time to go and do things like that. Most of the time I have that's available to me, I spend with my child, or I spend working on my own stuff. So it's nice for me to be able to see art in person when I can, and it's also not a huge priority for me.
And then you, as an artist, have relatively recently developed another branch for your visual art. You have turned to tattooing. I mean, like, apart from the fact that you yourself have 1 or 2 tattoos, how did that turn into a profession for you?
There's a bunch of different aspects to that. And I'd say the sort of the origin story has to do with my interest in rock and roll. Just getting into heavy metal when I was a very young kid, 9 or however old I was, I immediately noticed not only the graphics that were presented along with the albums themselves, but just also what the musicians looked like. And they wore strange clothes, and they had lots of tattoos and outlandish outfits, and that was appealing to me. There was an element of sort of like ritual donning of a costume in order to perform a ritual, and a lot of it was sort of campy and ridiculous, but then there was also something about it that I think touched something deeper in me, just like this idea that you put something on to become another person in order to perform a specific act, and in these cases a specific creative act. So in some ways, I think tattooing, and my interest in it goes all the way back to that early recognition of people decorating themselves and how that identified them. And then another aspect of it, kind of on the flip side, is it is a practical way in which I can use my particular skills to provide for my family and make money. And I have been lucky enough to find different activities in my life that are closely related to the things that I just want to do anyway, that also allow me to serve the very practical need of having money to buy food and have a place to live.
Yeah.
So tattooing for me in that way has been great, because as a parent of a young child, I don't want to be touring all the time. And that's basically been my primary source of income as an adult, as a touring musician. And I don't want to be gone all the time. And so tattooing was something I was interested in already. And then it became apparent to me that it could be a thing that I could do that was a creative pursuit that also had a social aspect to it, of being in a shop setting with coworkers as well as clients, that would kind of fulfill that need for having a creative social outlet, and also allow me to stay home more often.
Mm.
And I think the final component is art and music have been, they've been a constant in my adult life. And while, as we've discussed, I'm not content to just kind of um, rest on the work that I've done. I'm always interested in pursuing and further challenges. I basically know what I'm doing with making music and making art. I know how to play guitar. I know how to use a brush and a pen. Tattooing is an entirely different practice in terms of the technical process of giving a tattoo. And for me, that's a invigorating challenge and also a humbling experience, which I think I need. I think I need to be challenged by learning something else. I think I want and need to be humbled by being a beginner at something at this stage of my life. A lot of tattooers that I know started in some cases in their teens or at the latest in their early 20s, and so taking up something in my mid 40s and having zero skill in that area has been really really hard and frustrating, and also really, like I said, invigorating for me.
So as I said, if you ever come to Europe to do like a stint here or there, I'm client numero uno.
Okay,
Honestly,
happy
uh,
I'm happy to do it. I'm
yeah,
happy to do it, and I'm grateful for the fact that anybody wants to get tattoos from me, because honestly, as I said, I'm a beginner in this practice, and I'm aware of the fact that many, if not most, of the people who are coming to me are doing it not because I'm very good at tattooing, but because they like my art and my music. And so I'm lucky in that regard to have that little loophole there.
hmm. One thing that struck me while I was preparing this interview, I know that you're not one of those highly competitive jocks that you've mentioned. You probably were not the sports guy, you're not the quarterback back in high school.
Yep.
However, I felt as if there was one person with which you had a very good friendship level, but somebody who pushed you and you pushed him. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is Jacob that one person who you've known for a very, very long time, who is also a very good visual designer, where you two pushed each other and bounced off of each other?
Maybe early on, definitely when I was starting HydraHead and establishing it in Boston, Jake was a person that I spent a lot of time with and who was very helpful for me. He had a great grasp on how to use the computer as a tool, a design tool, and a lot of what I learned from just sitting with him while he was helping put together a sleeve for HydraHead, or asking him about, different specific questions about using a program or a specific font or something like that. But that was really only in the first couple
Mm-hmm.
years uh, of doing HydraHead. And after that, Jake and I just kind of went our separate ways, not because of any falling out, but just we became busy with our own pursuits. Um, and I think that there was probably a lot of musical and visual common ground there that led us both to being where we are. Um, at the same time, Jake is not a person I've had an ongoing um, artistic dialogue with. He's not a person that I still have these conversations with. There's been another group of people over the last 20 years that I've become more connected to, who I would say are a regular part of my artistic practice, in terms of people um, whose opinions I value and whose conversations, who I have conversations with regularly enough that it informs my process.
Mm, I can see that. And of course, you live on totally opposite ends of a continent, which is always also a difficult thing, right? So,
Yeah, for
Aaron,
sure.
first of all, thanks for all those insights and all those cool ideas about you as an artist and also the connections to your music. However, nobody leaves the Veil of Sound interview without having to go for a quickfire round. So I'll always give you two alternatives, like Coca-Cola versus Pepsi, deep dish pizza versus real pizza, Michigan versus Wisconsin, whatever. And you have to choose. So let's start with two artists that I'm very sure you know. And you have to choose which one would you rather hang up on your wall. Derek Hess versus Frank Kozik.
Oh boy. Derek Cass.
Can you explain that a little bit? Or do you have one specific thing in mind?
No, just Kozik. Kozik is very graphic and simple, and a lot of it is I wouldn't say sterile, but very clean. And Derek has always had a much more kinetic, sort of raw aspect to his work, and that definitely appeals to me more. It looks more. Well, I should say it looks less calculated and more vigorous to me.
Mm-hmm. Posters, of course, in our realms are a huge thing. Do you rather prefer like psychedelic posters of, let's say, the 60s or 70s, or like those technoid, like very much leaning into technology things of the 80s and 90s, which is more to your liking?
I mean, I would say some of the 60s stuff, but not even necessarily like the psychedelic stuff per se. Like when I think about poster art, the stuff I really like a lot would be like Saul Boss, like the Hitchcock posters.
Mm-hmm.
Just really cool typography, really graphic, really simple color schemes, but just um, a lot of very intentional and very precise arrangement of elements in space. And poster art for me is very much a graphic design pursuit. And so the stuff that I think functions the best is the stuff that's most oriented towards that, towards that idea of serving an ultimately commercial purpose of conveying what the thing is that it's presenting in this very eye-catching way. And I think that again, just talking about Saul Boss, like his style was very identifiable, although it became less identifiable because so many people emulated it. But his style was very identifiable, and it was very clearly artistic, and he was also able to effectively create pieces that did what they were supposed to do, which is promote the films to which they were attached.
When you're already talking about film, I didn't want to go into that, but then I at least give you two directors, and I think we both like most of their work. Alfred Hitchcock versus Stanley Kubrick. Whose oeuvre do you or can you enjoy more?
Kubrick for sure. I mean, there would be no Kubrick without Hitchcock, but I've spent a lot more time watching Kubrick than I have Hitchcock. And we were talking earlier about, you know, the idea of a perfect piece of art or music. And for me, that doesn't exist within my own efforts. However, there are things I can look at from others that I perceive as being damn near close to perfect. And I think Kubrick's got some movies like that that are just so they come across more as um it's not so much apparent as a creation of a person as it seems like a dream which has been accurately presented through through the human filter, um,
Mhm.
for other people to experience. And for me, I was just having a conversation with Faith about this the other day. If you were able to extract these things that you see in dreams and present them as pieces of art for other people, it would be pretty miraculous, because the things our minds are capable of is pretty wondrous. And Kubrick to me is one of those directors who has come closest to that, where
Mhm.
there is something so believable and so powerful, yet so simultaneously otherworldly that it's overwhelming, and also just seems um, utterly otherworldly. There's just no other way to put it. It's like he reached into another dimension and was able to put it in front of you.
I can totally get that. You've spoken about fine art, and I want to give you two couples, and we'll start with probably the two most famous Spanish painters of the 20th century, uh, Picasso versus Dali.
Picasso.
Mhm. I
Um,
would have bet on that one.
yeah, Dolly is, I mean, he's interesting, and he was interesting to me when I was younger. But again, going back to Hess and Kozik, Picasso was much more exploratory and at times much more aggressively experimental. Dolly's ideas were certainly very obviously surreal and highly invested in that exploration of surreality. Uh, Picasso, though, seemed more interested in um, his personal evolution. He
Mhm.
never rested in one period indefinitely. He kind of just moved from one thing to the next, and in some cases, made really radical turns in direction. And for me, that's it, that willingness to just kind of abandon something for which you received accolades and praise and pursue something else entirely different is almost more interesting to me than the results themselves. It's like this
Mhm.
idea of that's this idea of pursuing what you need to do versus what people expect of you. And I think
Yeah.
that to me has been kind of an artistic ethos to follow.
Is it also
Not
because
not
Dali?
specific, not specifically because of Picasso, but just in terms of the art that I've
Mhm.
appreciated throughout
Yeah.
my life, art and music.
Is that then also, is that preference for Dali maybe also due to a little bit due to the fact that Dali, of course, is much more planned, less intuitive than lots of Picasso stuff?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. There are things that I appreciate that are highly refined. I mean, Kubrick's another example. Like his work could not could not be done in a very incautious way. There's a lot of calculation that had to occur there. But most often, especially with music and painting, the element of danger that's apparent in work that has rough edges is definitely appealing to me.
As you were speaking about pop art, Roy Lichtenstein versus Keith Haring.
Keith Haring. Um, and I gotta say, neither of them are particularly appealing to me visually,
Mhm.
but Keith Haring as an artist seems like a more interesting person, and certainly more radical, and had a political component for sure to what he was doing. Um, whereas Liechtenstein might have been kind of defying expectations within the art world, but ultimately, for me, it's kind of, I don't know, I'm not going to say vapid necessarily, but there's just not a lot there. And I know that that was partially the point. Whereas I guess it feels more self-referential to the art world, whereas what Keith Haring was doing had more relevance to the world and to people on a wider scale, and that makes it more interesting to me.
You've also mentioned your love for comics. So I'll give you two comic artists. Alan Moore versus Todd McFarlane.
No contest there. I mean, one is much more a writer and the other is visual, so it's a little bit hard to compare, but Alan Moore for sure. Todd McFarlane is an excellent draftsman. Ultimately, though, pretty safe and conventional in most ways. And whereas Alan Moore very much purposely was trying to subvert the comics form altogether, and is very much aligned with a lot of my own ideas about what art can be. McFarlane seems content to kind of just exist within the world of commercial comics production, whereas I think Alan Moore is simply using comics as a conduit for his ideas about spirituality, about existence, about everything from the most trivial to the most grand aspects of human existence. So it's very far-reaching in its aim, sometimes to the point of being not necessarily pretentious, but it's it can at times be kind of it can kind of crumple under its own weight, I suppose. But for the most part, he's created a lot of really successful and adventurous work. So yeah, for me, I mean, he's just an influential character for me, absolutely. Whereas McFarlane, as a teenager was a person whose drawings I tried to copy, but as an adult has very little relevance to my creative pursuits or existence.
And when we talk about Marvels, I always love to ask the following question, because I think it shows a little bit about the person, at least over here in Europe. Marvel versus DC.
I mean, they, both those things as entities figured largely in my early years. Again, not so much now.
Yeah.
But definitely, I would say, back in those years, Marvel would have been much more interesting to me. The idea, especially with the X-Men, of a band literally of mutants and, in other words, outsiders.
Yeah.
Their existence was kind of antisocial in a certain way. That was much more relatable to me than the idea of, Superman, for instance, this very
he's too clean, isn't he?
Very broadly appealing, and almost, I guess, sort of like the invincibility of Superman. Obviously, he had his foes or whatever who knew his weak points, and there was kryptonite, but that was a lot less believable or relatable to me than a character like Spider-Man, who, for instance, who was like essentially a scared teenage boy who tried his best to reconfigure his world after undergoing a massive change.
I have two more questions like that for you. We have been talking about corporate identity, and I know that is not something that you really strive for. But very often, corporate identity is also connected to having something like a mascot. And in our realms of heavy music, there are a few bands whose mascots have outgrown them. And I think that the following two, I know you know them, and you just have to choose between Eddie and the Crimson Ghost.
Eddie for sure. I mean, partially because Eddie was a creation specific to Iron Maiden versus the Crimson Ghost, who was, adopted as a mascot. And again, just talking about formative things for me, I didn't really get the Misfits when I was young, at least with my initial exposure to them. I was way more invested in metal than I was in punk in my early years. And when I first heard the Misfits, I was like, "What is this racket?" Like, it didn't make sense to me. And Maiden, though they were never one of my favorites, certainly had some albums that I spent quite a bit of time with. And part of the appeal was definitely the sleeves. I remember looking at those Derek Riggs paintings, for the first 10 or so Maiden albums and just finding them very compelling. And sometimes, yeah, more than the music itself. I think I probably liked Crazy Eddie more as a visual than I liked any Iron Maiden song. But the two kind of put together were an interesting juxtaposition for me, and it helped create a world around this band that went just, again, kind of beyond liking a song here or there.
And I think Eddie is also much more adaptable. You can put him in a lot of different phases and faces and facades, whatever, and it's always still recognizably Eddie. Whereas for Crimson Ghost, more or less always the same.
Just is what it is. Yeah. And there's like this idea of Eddie simultaneously existing across different times and realities. And so there's a lot more room for a narrative there.
Last one. And here I close the cycle to one of the other interviews here in our Christmas marathon. A few days ago, I was talking to Steve Von Till. And when I prepared for that interview and we were talking about New Road recordings, and I saw that ISIS was the fifth band outside of any Neurosis related projects to release an album or a record through New Road recordings. So my question for you, when you look at Neurosis and you have to choose between the covers for Souls at Zero and Enemy of the Sun, which one would you choose?
Definitely Enemy of the Sun,
Okay.
simply because that was the first Neurosis record that I encountered, and it had a very, very big impact on me, musically, and to a lesser extent visually. I remember the front and back cover for that record just being really striking to me when I first got it in the mail, and the cover also, I think, in a way, is a great representation of the music that it's the face of. And so, yeah, that's an easy one for me. I know Souls at Zero for a lot of people is a very iconic cover, and I like it, but it to me did not have nearly the same impact. And also, again, it was hard for me to go back and hear Souls at Zero and find it as compelling as Enemy of the Sun was when I first heard it. I think Souls at Zero was like a transitional step for them where they were becoming something, but I think Enemy of the Sun was like where they had arrived at becoming what they did.
Before anybody asks why I chose those two, I chose those two specifically because I think they have covers that can be put into so many narratives, more narratives than, for example, through Silver and Blood. My favorite, my second favorite, my favorite is Grace, but one of my favorite Neurosis albums. But I think when it comes to narratives behind a record cover by Neurosis or for a Neurosis record, and Souls at Zero and Enemy are the ones that are most applicable to a multitude of narratives. One very, very last question, and I'm not sure if you can pick one very, very easily, but maybe you do. Do you have an all-time favorite record cover that you have not worked on, neither as a band nor as an artist?
No, I definitely not. I mean, there have been many record sleeves that I've encountered in my life that have been important to me for one reason or another, but certainly none that would stand out above the others as an all-time favorite.
Is that also because you perceive art also as a process and not as a finite thing?
I mean, yeah, and also just because there have been different things at different times of my life where, an album, and there could be an album cover from my youth that was so important to me because of what the album represented
Mhm.
at that point versus, looking at sleeves through my eyes later on. I was able to um critically appraise them of their visual worth, both in terms of how striking they were as an image and how appropriately they conveyed the ideas of the record to which they were connected. But also simply just because there's so much that I've ingested throughout my life and so much that's been important to me that it would be hard to say, this sleeve is the most important to me. And yeah, it's partially because of what you said, but also because sleeves serve a lot of different functions in terms of what they do for an album and for the person encountering it.
I know that if I had asked a lot of people in the post-metal or heavy rock world, I'm very sure that a lot of people would have mentioned one of the record covers that you've done, or one of the record covers for your bands and projects. It's very nice to see that you, how should I say, think of it a little differently, not in terms of like favorite ever. Aaron,
Yeah.
thanks for your time. Thanks for all the cool thoughts, interconnections between the artist and the musician, and enjoy the rest of your day. Now, here is your chance for the first, final, last words in 2024 to our audience. Your stage is yours.
Oh, well, without sounding trite or maybe trivializing the complexity of all the things that are happening, any effort that each one of us can make to be kinder and more understanding of one another is going to serve us in a very important way, to put it mildly. In fact, I would say our survival depends on it. So I wish for everyone to be kinder and gentler and more loving with themselves and with all those they encounter, and even those that we'll never meet or see in this particular moment of our existence.
I think that's a very good ending to a first interview in 2024. Aaron, thanks a lot for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.